She was the only woman in that glittering room who was not trying to be seen, and she was the only one he could not stop looking at. If you have ever watched someone be reduced to nothing by a single careless sentence, then you already know the kind of story this is, and you already know it is going to hurt before it heals. Welcome, dear viewer, to a tale of silence secrets, and the most dangerous thing a proud man can do: underestimate a woman. If this kind of storytelling moves you, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale like this one. Now, let us go back to England. The year is 1842, and a duke is about to make the worst assumption of his life. Ashford Manor sat on a hill the way proud men sit in chairs, with absolute certainty that the world below existed only to look up at it. Lord Callum Wren, the 8th Duke of Ashford, had returned from London in a foul temper, as he returned from most places, and his arrival at the Quarterly estate gathering his mother insisted on hosting had done nothing to improve his disposition. He stood at the edge of the grand salon, a glass of untouched claret in one hand, his dark eyes moving across the assembled company with the flat, assessing expression of a man who had already made up his mind about everyone in it. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a jaw that looked as though it had been carved for the express purpose of expressing displeasure. His dark hair was swept back without vanity, his cravat tied with precision rather than artistry, and everything about him communicated the same singular message: I would rather be elsewhere. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Vivian Wren, was a small woman with iron in her spine and roses on her tongue, and she had arranged this gathering, as she arranged everything, with a specific goal she had not entirely disclosed to her son. There were eligible young women here, daughters of good families and better dowries, and Vivian had been engineering introductions with the gracious persistence of a woman who understood that the right marriage could repair what grief and isolation had been slowly breaking apart in her only child. Callum had spoken to 3 young ladies in the past hour. He had been polite to all of them, engaged with none of them, and had communicated through the silence of his retreating back that no further introductions would be welcome. His mother found him at the edge of the room with the particular expression that meant she was about to ignore his preferences entirely. There is someone I would like you to meet, she said. Mother. She arrived this afternoon. She is the ward of Lady Pemworth, who, as you know, passed in February and left her affairs in a rather complicated state. The girl has nowhere suitable to go, and I thought, I am not a charitable institution. You are a duke with 17 empty rooms and a mother who is asking you politely. Vivian touched his arm with the lightness of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply. Simply meet her. That is all. Callum turned, more to end the conversation than out of any genuine interest, and that was when he saw her. She stood near the far window, slightly apart from the clusters of guests who moved and murmured around her like water around a stone. She was not beautiful in the way that announced itself. She did not shine or sparkle or arrange herself for observation. She was perhaps 23, with dark hair dressed simply, a gown of deep gray that had clearly been turned and mended, but was worn with a dignity that made its poverty irrelevant. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her eyes, a shade of brown so dark they were nearly black in the candlelight, were moving across the room with quiet, deliberate attention. She was watching everyone, not with the wide, eager watchfulness of a girl hoping to be noticed. With something quieter and more precise than that, the focused, cataloging gaze of someone who was reading the room rather than admiring it. Even as Callum studied her, her eyes moved from one face to another, following lips, tracking gestures, absorbing information with an efficiency he found strangely unsettling. He crossed to where his mother had already positioned herself beside the young woman. Lord Ashford, Vivian said, may I present Miss Alara Voss. She has been under Lady Pemworth's care for the past 4 years. She paused, and Callum detected the delicacy in her next words. Miss Voss does not speak. She has been mute since childhood, but she is educated, capable, and mute, Callum repeated. He said it flatly, not cruelly, but without warmth, the way a man names a complication. He looked at Alara directly, then, and she looked back at him. She did not flinch. She did not duck her eyes in the practiced deference he had come to expect from young women in his presence. She simply met his gaze with a steadiness that, had he been a more perceptive man in that particular moment, would have told him everything. He was not, in that moment, a perceptive man. "There is a position in the household," he said, turning back to his mother, as though Alara were not standing 3 feet away. "Something appropriate. Mrs. Hartwell can determine the particulars." He glanced once more at the young woman, that swift, assessing glance of a man categorizing and filing. "She will have room and board. That should suffice as a charitable arrangement." His mother began to protest. This was not what she had intended at all. But Callum had already set down his claret and turned toward the corridor. "She cannot hear propriety being broken on her behalf," he said, low enough that only Vivian caught it. "She will not know the difference between a ward and a servant. It is a practical solution." He walked away. He was wrong on both counts, of course. Alara could not hear his words, but she had read every one of them directly from his lips, with perfect, crystalline clarity, from the moment he had opened his mouth. She watched him walk away, that long, certain stride of a man who had never once considered that silence did not mean ignorance, and she allowed herself one single, private breath. Not of hurt. She had been hurt before, and by far more practiced cruelty than this. It was something closer to recognition. She had walked into dangerous rooms before. She had learned to map them quickly, to find the exits, to understand who held the power and where that power was fragile. She had survived by watching, by listening in the only language available to her, by knowing things that people freely said in her presence because they believed the air around her was safe. Lord Callum Wren, 8th Duke of Ashford, had just told her precisely who he was. And she had heard him perfectly. She turned back to the window, folded her hands again, and returned to reading the room. She had work to do. Ashford Manor had 43 rooms, and Alara Voss had memorized the purpose of each one within her first 72 hours of residence. This was not remarkable to her. It was simply what she did, what she had always done, in every house she had ever been placed in, every institution that had received her with the particular mixture of pity and inconvenience that the world reserved for those it did not know how to categorize. She learned spaces the way other people learned languages, quickly, thoroughly, and with an attention to the irregular verbs that most people never bothered to study. The irregular verbs of a household were its secrets, the rooms that were locked at odd hours, the servants who avoided certain corridors, the patterns of movement that shifted when the master of the house was near. She was given a room on the 3rd floor at the end of the east wing, in a corridor that housed the ladies' maids and the seamstress. It was a small room with a narrow window that looked out over the kitchen garden, a bed with a wool blanket, a washstand, and a single candle in a tin holder. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, a tall woman with a long face and the exhausted competence of someone who had been managing other people's chaos for 30 years, had shown her to it with a brisk efficiency that was not unkind, but was entirely without warmth. Mrs. Hartwell had communicated through a series of gestures and mimed instructions, under the clear impression that Alara was not only mute, but entirely unreachable by ordinary communication. Alara had followed along with an expression of cooperative simplicity, nodding at the appropriate moments, accepting the folded uniform dress with both hands and a small inclination of her head that seemed to satisfy the housekeeper's minimal requirements. When Mrs. Hartwell left and the door clicked shut, Alara set the dress on the bed, walked to the window, and stood very still for a long moment, looking out at the kitchen garden below. Then she sat at the edge of the bed, opened the small leather satchel that contained everything she owned, and withdrew a notebook. It was nearly full. She was always running out of notebooks, and she turned to a fresh page near the back, uncapped the small ink bottle she kept wrapped in a cloth, and began to write in the small, precise hand she had developed over years of making the most of limited paper. Ashford Manor, March 14th, 1842. East wing, 3rd floor, room at corridor's end. Window faces north, kitchen garden, low wall, gate that appears to be unlatched. Housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell. Efficient. Not curious. Will not watch me closely. The Duke's study. Ground floor, south side, heavy curtains, seen through hall window on arrival. Library, 1st floor east. Locked. The Dowager's rooms. First floor, west wing, flowers on the sill, curtains open. She wants light. She is not afraid of being seen. She paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page. The Duke, 30, perhaps 31. Managed grief poorly and long. Anger is a secondary emotion. Beneath it, something more like exhaustion. He did not look at me the way cruel men look at inconvenient women. He looked at me the way tired men look at problems they have already decided not to solve. That is almost more dangerous. She closed the notebook, replaced it carefully in the satchel, and began to unpack. By the end of her first week, she had learned the rhythm of the entire household. She rose before the other servants, dressed in the pre-dawn dark, and was often in the kitchen before the cook arrived. Not because she had been instructed to be, but because the kitchen in the early morning was the most information-rich room in any house. Servants talked freely in those unguarded hours before the day's performance began. They stood at the range and complained about the guests, gossiped about the family, and traded observations about life inside Ashford Manor with the uninhibited frankness of people who believed, entirely, that the quiet girl in the corner by the window could not understand a single word. She understood every word. She learned that the Duke had not always been this way. The older servants, particularly a round-faced footman named Thomas, who had been with the family for 11 years, spoke of a younger Callum Wren with something that resembled fondness. A man who had ridden hard across the estate in the early mornings and laughed at his mother's wit and argued about philosophy with the estate's former steward. A man who had been engaged once to a woman named Catherine Aldridge, daughter of a Northumberland baron. The engagement had ended, not by the lady's choosing, and whatever had happened in those final weeks before the announcement was a subject that caused Thomas to lower his voice and the cook to turn meaningfully back to her bread. Alara filed all of it carefully away. She observed the Duke himself with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that people reveal themselves most completely when they believe they are unobserved. She was, by the nature of her reputation in the household, effectively invisible. The mute girl, the charity case, the ward who had been assigned to light dusting and the arrangement of flowers and other tasks that required no communication and minimal presence. It was the perfect position, and she had been placed in it by a man who thought he was being practical. She watched Callum Wren read his morning correspondence at the desk in the small breakfast room, and she noticed that he sorted his letters into 2 piles before opening any of them. And that the second pile, the one he set to his left, he always opened last and always read standing up, as though he needed to be ready to move when the contents reached him. She watched him in the evenings when he paced the length of the east corridor before dinner, exactly 11 paces one direction and 11 paces back, the walk of a man attempting to exercise something out of his body that had no intention of leaving. She watched him with his mother, the subtle softening around his eyes when Vivian said something that amused him, the way his hand rested briefly on the back of her chair when he passed her at the table, gentle and unconscious, and entirely at odds with the armored person he presented to everyone else. She watched him notice her, too. It happened gradually, the way all significant things happen, without announcement. He would enter a room, and his eyes would move, in that swift cataloging way, across the space, and then stop briefly on her. Not with interest, or not with the kind of interest he would have recognized as such. With something more like the faint unease of a man who keeps finding the same book on a different shelf than where he left it. She was always precisely where she was supposed to be, doing precisely what she had been assigned to do. And yet something about her presence in his peripheral vision seemed to quietly rearrange itself in a way he could not account for. One morning, he passed the door of the morning room where she was arranging a vase of early spring flowers, and he stopped. She did not look up. She kept her hands moving among the stems with the calm, focused attention she brought to every visible task, while every other part of her attention was directed, completely, at him. He stood in the doorway for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he walked on. She allowed herself the smallest exhale. He was beginning to see her. He did not yet know what he was seeing, did not yet have a language for the particular quality of stillness she carried, the watchfulness that was not passivity but precision. But something in him had registered that the young woman his household had accepted as furniture was something other than furniture, and that instinct, however early and unformed, was the first true thing he had understood about her. In her notebook that evening, she wrote 2 words beneath his name: paying attention. And then, beneath that, with the careful honesty she always reserved for the page: so am I. There is a particular kind of cruelty that does not know itself, that walks through the world in the clothing of reason, of practicality, of simply stating facts. And it is, in many ways, the most difficult kind to defend against, because the person wielding it will look you in the eye and tell you, with complete sincerity, that they have done nothing wrong. Lord Callum Wren was that kind of cruel. Not the theatrical sort, not the sneering, deliberate villain who takes pleasure in the damage he causes. His cruelty was architectural. It was built into the structure of how he moved through the world, load-bearing and invisible, so thoroughly integrated into his behavior that he had long since ceased to notice it was there. He spoke about people in their presence because he had decided they could not understand him. He made decisions about lives he considered peripheral to his own without consultation, because consultation implied that the other person's preferences were relevant. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The dismissal was always delivered quietly, and that quietness was the sharpest part of it. Ilara had known men like this before. She had learned to map the architecture of their coldness, the way she mapped the rooms of their houses, not to excuse it, but to navigate it, to find where the walls were thinnest. And the walls of Callum Wren, she was discovering, were considerably thinner than they appeared. It was the portrait that first showed her the crack. It hung in the upper gallery, a long cold corridor on the 2nd floor that the household used primarily as a throughway between the guest wing and the main staircase. Most of the paintings, there were the standard aristocratic catalogue. Ancestors in stiff collars, landscapes of the estate across different seasons, a pair of hunting dogs rendered with more tenderness than most of the human subjects. But at the far end of the gallery, alone on the wall in a heavy gilt frame, was a portrait of a man she did not recognize. He was perhaps 50 in the painting, with Callum's dark coloring and a broader version of his jaw, but something in the eyes was different, lighter, somehow, despite the formal composition. He had been painted in this very house, standing at a window she recognized as the one in the south study, and there was something almost careless in his posture, as though he had been caught mid-turn and the painter had captured him before the formality could settle back into place. She had stopped to look at it on her 3rd day, and she had been standing before it for perhaps 2 minutes when she became aware, the particular awareness of a person who has trained every non-auditory sense to compensate for one that does not function, that she was no longer alone in the gallery. She turned to find the Duke standing at the corridor's entrance. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the portrait, and the expression on his face was so unguarded that she felt briefly that she had intruded on something private, something that had nothing to do with the physical space and everything to do with the interior one. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as his effort at composure, but his eyes, those flat, assessing eyes, had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that hurt. He stood there for perhaps 3 seconds before his gaze dropped and found her standing before the painting. The shutters came down immediately. She watched them close, that swift, practiced sealing. And then he was the Duke again, controlled and faintly irritated by the universe's continued failure to arrange itself to his specifications. "That corridor," he said, without greeting, "is not part of your assigned rooms." She met his eyes and held them, and she saw him register, as he always did, the absence of the flinching deference he expected. Then she looked, quite deliberately, at the cleaning cloth in her hand, and then at the row of picture frames along the wall, and back at him. He looked at the cleaning cloth. He looked at the frames, several of which bore the fine gray film of accumulated dust. He looked back at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite embarrassment, but was adjacent to it. "Carry on," he said, and walked away. She turned back to the portrait and did not smile. Smiling would have been for someone else's benefit, and there was no one to perform it for. But she noted it carefully. The portrait undid him in a way that nothing else she had yet observed could manage. It was involuntary and total, The way grief always is when it has never been properly attended to. He loved whoever that man had been. He had loved him and lost him and built an entire architecture of coldness over the absence. And the architecture was load-bearing precisely because the grief beneath it had never been given anywhere to go. She confirmed this 2 days later through Mrs. Hartwell, who mentioned, while directing the weekly polishing of the silver, that the late Duke had passed 3 years prior, unexpectedly, in the middle of a hunting trip, and that the current Duke had never been quite the same since. She said it with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone delivering a known quantity, and then moved on to instructions about the fish forks. 3 years. Alara thought about that. 3 years of building one cold refusal and one dismissal at a time, the structure that now constituted Lord Callum Wren. 3 years of grief pressing itself down into architecture. She thought about it again the following week when the letter arrived. She was in the entrance hall, attending to the flower arrangement on the central table, when the post was brought in by the young footman, Thomas, who sorted it with cheerful efficiency into the silver tray. She was not watching Thomas. She was watching the moment 8 minutes later, when the Duke came down the main stairs and collected the post himself, a task that was technically beneath his station, which meant he did it on purpose, which meant the post contained something he did not want handled by anyone else before he saw it. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and went through the letters with that practiced sorting motion. Right pile, left pile. And when he reached the one she could see bore a London seal in dark red wax, something happened to his hands. They stilled. Completely. For just a moment, the hands of the man who prided himself on absolute self-command went perfectly motionless over a sealed letter. The way a person goes still when they are bracing for something they have been dreading for a long time. Then he put the letter in his coat pocket, not on the left pile, not on the right, but in his pocket, against his body, and walked toward his study with the measured, even stride of a man performing normalcy for an invisible audience. She did not yet know what the letter contained, but she had been in enough dangerous houses to recognize the specific quality of a man carrying something he was afraid of, and to understand that the fear of a powerful man, improperly handled, had a way of becoming everyone else's problem before it was resolved. She returned to her flowers. She kept her face composed and her movements unhurried, the portrait of a woman who had registered nothing. And she turned the London seal over and over in her mind, pressing it like a bruise to see where it hurt. The library door had been locked every single day since Alara's arrival, and that more than anything else in Ashford Manor told her exactly where she needed to go. She had not been told explicitly that the library was forbidden to her. It had not been necessary. The locked door was its own instruction, and in a household where her presence was considered approximately equivalent to that of a well-behaved piece of furniture, no one had thought to explain the prohibition directly. Forbidden spaces were for people whose curiosity was considered worth managing. Hers, apparently, was not. This was, she reflected, their mistake. She had identified the library on her first day, a set of double doors on the first floor, east corridor, with a keyhole that caught the light in a way that told her it was used regularly. Not abandoned, not sealed for preservation, but actively kept closed. The difference mattered. An abandoned room holds old secrets. A locked room holds current ones. She waited 3 weeks before she went in. Patience was, perhaps, the most practical gift her silence had given her. The world moved at the speed of sound, and she had long ago learned to move at a different speed entirely. The speed of observation, of accumulation, of waiting until the moment was not merely available, but precisely right. She watched the household patterns until she could have drawn them on paper. Who retired early, who walked the corridors late, what the Duke's evening schedule looked like on the nights. He did not have correspondence to keep him in his study until midnight. On a Tuesday, in early April, she determined that the night was right. Mrs. Hartwell locked her own door at 9:30. Alara had confirmed this 3 evenings running by watching the strip of light beneath it go dark. Thomas, the footman, played cards in the servants' hall until 10 and then went noisily to bed. The Duke, on Tuesday evenings, invariably spent 2 hours in his study after dinner, and on the 3 Tuesdays she had observed, he had gone upstairs at 10:30 without variation. She waited until 11. The corridor was dark except for the moonlight that came through the window at its far end, laying a pale rectangle across the floorboards with the particular stillness of a house that has gone to sleep. She moved along the wall, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the wood. This, too, was something she had trained herself into over years, the instinct for quiet movement that had nothing to do with her voice and everything to do with survival. She had learned early that a world that cannot hear you speak will also not hear you coming, and that this was either a vulnerability or an advantage depending entirely on how you chose to use it. The library key had been the work of an afternoon. She had observed Mrs. Hartwell's key ring, noted the library key by its distinctive age-darkened bow, and spent a patient hour one day in the brief window when the ring hung unattended on the hook in the housekeeper's sitting room. She had not taken a key. She had taken a careful impression of it in a piece of soft beeswax she had prepared beforehand, re-wrapped in cloth and pressed smooth, and had then spent 2 evenings with a worn file and a blank key she had purchased from the ironmongers in the village during the weekly supply run, producing a copy that turned in the lock on her second attempt. She was not a thief. She was a reader. There is a difference, and it matters. The library opened before her like an exhale. It was larger than she had estimated from the outside, a long, high-ceilinged room with shelves that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, accessible by a rolling ladder on a brass rail that she could see even in the moonlight had been used recently, its wheels freshly oiled. A reading table occupied the center of the room, bare except for a single candlestick. 2 leather chairs faced the cold fireplace, and between them, on a low table, sat a glass that had held brandy recently enough that she could detect the faint ghost of it as she moved deeper into the room. He had been here this evening. Recently. She moved to the nearest shelf and ran her fingertips along the spines in the slow, deliberate way she had always touched books, not reading the titles yet, simply feeling the room, the weight of it, the particular atmosphere that a collection of books develops when it belongs to someone who actually reads them rather than displaying them. These books were read. She could tell by the way they sat, some pushed back, some pulled forward, some leaning against their neighbors with the comfortable disorder of things that were regularly disturbed and replaced by a person who knew exactly where each one lived. She found the French philosophy section by the 3rd shelf, Voltaire, Rousseau, Descartes, Montesquieu, and drew out a volume of Rousseau's political writings, not because she needed to verify her own ability to read it, but because she wanted to be inside this room properly, with a book in her hands, in the way she had been inside no room in this house since her arrival. She had been reading for perhaps 20 minutes, cross-legged in one of the leather chairs with the moonlight falling adequately across the page, when the door opened. She did not hear it, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the change in the quality of the darkness at the edge of her peripheral vision, and she looked up. The Duke stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, without his coat or cravat, holding a candlestick in one hand and wearing the expression of a man who had expected to find an empty room and had instead found something he did not have an immediate category for. His dark hair was slightly disordered, as though he had already half prepared for bed and then thought better of it. He looked younger, without the formal armor of his day clothes. He also looked considerably more dangerous, in the way that people who are caught unguarded often do, not dangerous to her, but to himself, to the careful construction of who he had decided to be. His eyes went from her face to the book in her hands, to the key on the arm of the chair beside her, and back to her face. She did not close the book. She did not stand. She met his eyes with the same level steadiness she always offered him, and she waited. She watched him work through it, could read the sequence on his face as clearly as print. The first response was the familiar reflex. She should not be here. She had no permission. She had obtained entry by means he had not authorized. The reprimand was already forming behind his eyes. She could see it assembling itself. And then his gaze dropped back to the book. Rousseau, Duc Contrat Social, in French, open to the 3rd chapter, which he had been reading with the focused attention of someone engaging an argument rather than decoding a text. She watched him recalibrate. He crossed the room slowly, as though he was not entirely sure what protocol applied here, and had decided to postpone the decision until he was closer. He stopped at the reading table, set his candlestick down, and looked at her from a distance of perhaps 5 feet. In the combined light of moon and candle, his expression had moved past the reprimand and into something she had not seen on his face before. He reached out and turned the book gently in her hands, not taking it from her, just tilting it enough to confirm the title and the chapter. His finger moved briefly to the top of the page, tracing the line of text she had been reading. Then he looked up at her. "You can read French," he said. It was not a question, but it wore the shape of one. The stunned shape of a man revising a structural assumption while still standing on the floor that assumption had been supporting. She looked at him steadily. She reached for the small notebook she always kept in her pocket, uncapped the pen, and wrote in her clean, precise hand. She turned it to face him. "French, Latin, and Greek. And I have been reading since I was 4. The silence that followed was extraordinary. She had lived her whole life inside silence of one kind or another, but this particular silence was different. It had texture and temperature, and it pressed against the walls of the room with a weight that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He looked at the shelf behind her head, as though the books there might provide some structural support for a worldview that was quietly beginning to give way. He sat down in the chair opposite her, not to interrogate her, not to deliver the reprimand that had been forming earlier. He sat down with the bewildered, effortful gravity of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is entirely different from what he had been told it was, and who needs a moment to understand what that means for everything he has been walking on. She opened her book again, turned back to the 3rd chapter, and continued reading. She did not offer him anything further. He had not yet earned it. But she allowed herself, privately, the small and careful warmth of knowing that something had just cracked open in this house, something that could not be resealed, no matter how many locked doors stood between it and the rest of the world. There is a specific kind of fear that arrives not with a crash, but with a recognition. The slow, cold understanding that the danger you believed you had escaped has simply been waiting, with more patience than you, in a room you thought was safe. Ilara had known that feeling before. She had known it in the way a person knows a recurring weather pattern, not because they welcome it, but because they have survived it enough times to recognize its particular quality of light. She had felt it the first time in a schoolroom when she was 9. She had felt it in the sitting room of Lady Pemworth's house in her 19th year, when a visitor had arrived and looked at her with an expression she had filed under knows something about you with quiet, competent dread. She had felt it at intervals since, in the precise moments when she understood that the world she had constructed around herself, the careful, watchful, fortified world of a woman who survived by knowing more than people believed she knew, had been penetrated by something she had not yet identified. She felt it now, standing at the sideboard of the Ashford Manor dining room on a Friday evening in late April, with 14 of England's most elaborately dressed people arranged around the long mahogany table below her. The Duchess Vivian had organized the dinner party with her characteristic precision, filling the table with the kind of guests who considered an evening at a duke's estate to be both a social obligation and a competitive sport. There were 2 members of Parliament, a baronet and his wife from Derbyshire, a pair of London solicitors whose connection to the Ashford estate Ilara had not yet fully mapped, and several other individuals whose names she had captured from the seating arrangements Mrs. Hartwell had left on the dining room table that afternoon. It was among those names that she had first felt it, that particular cold recognition. Lord Geoffrey Harwick, Viscount of Marfield. She had stood very still over the seating chart for a moment, her fingertip resting on the name without pressing it. The way you might rest your hand near a heat source to confirm it is still burning before you touch it directly. Then she had folded the feeling carefully away and spent the remaining hour before the guests arrived ensuring that her face communicated nothing whatsoever. Harwick arrived at 7 in a carriage that was newer and more aggressively appointed than the occasion strictly required. He was perhaps 50, with the particular physical confidence of a man who had been considered impressive for so long that his body had simply assumed the posture permanently. Silver at his temples, a broad chest, hands that were large and well-kept and suggested that whatever work they did was the kind that left no visible evidence. He moved through the entrance hall with the proprietary ease of someone who had been in many important rooms and found all of them, ultimately, navigable. Alara was arranging the last of the table settings when the guests were ushered in. She did not look up when Harwick entered. She did not need to look up to know precisely when his eyes found her, because the quality of the air in the room changed in the specific way it changes when a person is being watched by someone who is trying not to appear to be watching. She kept her hands moving. She set the final glass with quiet precision and stepped back toward the sideboard, folding into the background with the practiced ease of a woman who had made an art form of being overlooked. Dinner proceeded through its courses in the elaborate choreography of a formal Victorian table. Soup, fish, removes, entrees. All of it accompanied by the layered conversation of people performing their social selves for one another's benefit. Alara moved when required, was still when not, and directed the whole of her attention beneath the surface of her composed and functional exterior at the table. She read lips the way a musician reads a score, not word by word, but in phrases, in passages, tracking the rhythm of conversation across the table with the fluency of long practice. She caught the baronet's wife confiding to her neighbor that the Ashford estate had debts that were somewhat more extensive than generally known. She caught one of the solicitors confirming, in a murmur to the other, that the London matter was still unresolved. She caught Vivian Wren steering conversation away from the subject of Callum's marital prospects with the graceful persistence of a woman who has been doing it for years. And then she caught Harwick. He was seated near the center of the table, 3 positions to the Duke's left, and he had been performing the role of charming, well-connected dinner guest with professional fluency for the better part of 2 hours. But somewhere between the fish course and the entrees, his eyes moved, not to the Duke, not to Vivian, not to any of the other guests, but across the room to the sideboard. To her. It was brief. No one at the table would have noticed it. But she noticed it, and more importantly, she noticed what came after it. The fractional stillness, the very small adjustment of his posture, the way his gaze returned to the table, and then found, with careful casualness, the face of the man seated to his left. A younger man she had catalogued on his arrival as Harwick's companion rather than an independent guest. Thin, fair-haired, with a watchful economy of movement that she associated with men who were employed to be useful in ways that were not discussed at dinner tables. Harwick's lips moved. Low, close, angled away from the rest of the table. She was at the wrong angle for half of it, and the candlelight shifted once in a way that cost her a full phrase. But she caught enough. She must not. The candlelight. She adjusted her position by 3 small, entirely justified steps, moving to refill the water glass of the guest nearest her, and in doing so brought Harwick's profile into better light. Allowed to leave this estate. You understand. Whatever costs. She does not leave. The glass she was holding she set down with a steadiness that cost her something, because every animal instinct in her body had just fired simultaneously, and managing those instincts while maintaining a face of perfect, unreadable composure was among the most demanding things she had ever done. She returned to the sideboard. She stood straight. She breathed at a normal rate by counting the seconds between each breath, a technique she had developed at 15 and refined considerably since. She had known this moment was possible. She had not known until this instant that it had already arrived. Someone had placed her here. She had known since finding the letter that her arrival at Ashford Manor was not charitable accident, but she had not yet known who sat at the center of it, who had invested in the specific project of having her hidden in a countryside estate, certified by reputation as a woman who could communicate nothing to anyone. She had been building toward that knowledge carefully, a thread at a time. Lord Harwick had just handed her the thread. The question was no longer who. She had her answer, or the beginning of it. The question was now why, what she possessed, or what she knew, or what she was, that made her continued silence worth the effort of engineering her disappearance into another man's household. And beneath that question, pressing against it with a cold insistence of water against a dam, was the more immediate one. If Harwick had seen her here tonight, she was no longer hidden. She let her gaze move, once, to the head of the table. The Duke sat in the candlelight with a contained, slightly distant expression he wore at social gatherings, present, functional, fractionally armored against the performance of it all. As she watched, his eyes moved in their habitual way across the table. And then, as they had begun to do, with increasing frequency, they continued their arc until they reached the sideboard. They found her. They always found her, she had noticed. Wherever she was in a room, his peripheral attention eventually located her with the unconscious precision of something he had stopped noticing he did. She held his gaze for 1 second, just long enough to be deliberate. And she let him see, in the way that only a person of his particular intelligence would catch, that something had shifted in her face. Not fear. Something more controlled than fear, but carrying the same temperature. An alert. A signal. Whether he understood it or not, she could not know. He would understand it later. She would make certain of that. For now, she lowered her eyes back to the sideboard, resumed her composure as completely as if she had set down a heavy object and rolled her shoulders, and spent the remainder of the dinner doing what she did best. Watching. Accumulating. Building the architecture of what she knew into something she could use. Lord Harwick wanted her contained. He had paid for her silence and her invisibility and her reputation as a woman with nothing to communicate. He had miscalculated on every single count. And she was only just beginning. There is a difference between suspecting the truth and holding it in your hands. And that difference, Alara had learned, was not relief. It was weight. She had been carrying the suspicion for weeks like a stone in her pocket, smooth and constant, and always present at the edge of her awareness. She had turned it over in her mind during the quiet hours of early morning, during the long evenings when the house settled into its nighttime self, and she sat with her notebook, mapping what she knew against what she could prove. She had built careful theories around it, tested them against the evidence she had accumulated, discarded the ones that didn't hold and reinforced the ones that did. She was methodical in this the way she was methodical in everything, not because she was cold, but because she had learned, at considerable personal cost, that emotion without information was simply suffering, and that information, properly gathered and properly used, was the only reliable instrument she had ever possessed. What she had not yet been able to determine was the precise nature of the arrangement that had placed her at Ashford Manor. She knew it was not charitable. She knew it was deliberate. She knew that Lord Harwick was connected to it, and she knew, from the particular quality of the threat she had read on his lips across the dinner table, that the stakes of it were considerably higher than the simple social burial of an inconvenient young woman. But knowing the shape of a thing and knowing its substance are different orders of knowledge, and it was the substance she needed. She found it on a Wednesday morning in the second week of May, in the Duke's private study, in a letter that had been placed, not hidden, she would note later, with the careful precision of someone who could not afford self-deception, inside the front cover of an estate ledger on the third shelf of the study's bookcase. She had been assigned to dust the study that morning in the housekeeper's weekly rotation. Mrs. Hartwell ran the household on a schedule of such exacting regularity that Alara had been able to predict, 3 weeks in advance, that this Wednesday would be the morning she was in that room alone. She had not engineered it. She had simply waited for the household's own machinery to deliver what she needed, which was almost always more reliable than engineering. The study was a room that reflected its occupant with uncomfortable accuracy. It was not untidy, but it had the particular organized disorder of a space where actual work was done by someone who thought faster than they filed, papers in ordered stacks that suggested priority rather than category, books pulled and replaced with the frequency of someone conducting ongoing rather than concluded research, the desk surface bearing the faint ink ghosts of years of correspondence. It smelled of beeswax and paper and the cold ash of a fire that had been lit last night and not yet relayed, and underneath those things, faintly, the same brandy she had smelled in the library. She dusted methodically, working from the door toward the window in the pattern she always used, giving each surface its required attention while her eyes moved with their own separate, parallel attention across everything the room contained. The ledgers on the third shelf she reached after approximately 20 minutes, and she drew each one out individually to dust the shelf beneath, a perfectly natural action that required no additional justification. The letter was in the third ledger. She recognized the seal before she had fully processed what she was looking at. The same dark red wax she had seen on the letter the Duke had pocketed at the foot of the stairs 6 weeks ago. She had found a corner of that letter, torn and discarded in the cold grate of the study fireplace during a later cleaning rotation, and had preserved it in her notebook. Same seal. Same hand on the direction. She stood with the ledger in one hand and the letter in the other, and she made her decision in the space of a single breath. She would read it, she would remember it precisely, and she would replace it exactly as she found it. She had not come this far by leaving traces. The letter was dated the 14th of February, more than a month before her arrival at Ashford Manor. Lord Ashford, I write to you in the matter we discussed at Whitmore's Club in January, regarding the ward of the late Lady Pemworth. You will recall that I expressed considerable interest in ensuring the young woman's continued comfortable obscurity, and that you were good enough to indicate a possible arrangement. I am prepared to formalize that arrangement as discussed. The sum of £400, paid in 2 installments, the first upon her arrival at Ashford, the second upon confirmation that she remains in residence at the estate's discretion for no fewer than 12 months, is acceptable to me. I trust you will find the terms generous, given the simplicity of what is required. She is, as you know, unable to communicate any alarm. She presents no practical difficulty. She requires only to be kept from London, and from contact with anyone connected to the Aldbourne matter, for the period in question. After that, the legal proceedings will have concluded, and her testimony, such as it could ever be rendered, will be entirely moot. I need not remind you that our mutual interests in the Aldbourne matter are significant, and that the resolution I am working towards serves us both. I ask only your cooperation in this small and, I think, entirely painless matter. Your servant in this, G. Harwick. She read it twice. Not because she had failed to understand it the first time, but because understanding something and accepting it as real are not the same action, and her mind required the second reading to complete the translation from information to truth. £400. She had been purchased for £400 and placed in this house like evidence locked in a drawer, not imprisoned, not harmed, simply made inaccessible. Harwick was a meticulous man. He had not needed bars or locks. He had needed reputation and geography, and a duke willing to accept payment to maintain both. And he had acquired all three with the comfortable ease of a man who had long since learned that most things in this world had a price that could be met. The Aldbourne matter. She turned that phrase over carefully, pressing it for everything it would yield. Aldbourne was an estate in Wiltshire. She knew that much from a conversation she had read across a table at Lady Pemworth's house 2 years ago, in the early days of understanding that she was not simply an inconvenient orphan, but something more specifically threatening to specific people. There had been a financial collapse and a court case, and a name attached to both that she had never been able to fully surface. She had been, apparently, closer to surfacing it than she knew. Her testimony. Harwick had used that word, testimony, and the specificity of it settled over her like cold water. She was not simply inconvenient. She was a witness. She had seen something, or been present for something, or been adjacent to something. And whatever it was had the power, even now, even months after the fact, to unravel the legal proceedings Harwick was managing in London. She had been present at Lady Pemworth's house. Lady Pemworth, who had died in February under circumstances that had been described as natural, and that Alara had never been entirely satisfied with. She replaced the letter in the ledger with careful precision. She replaced the ledger on the shelf. She dusted the remainder of the room with the same methodical attention she had brought to the first half, and she returned to the corridor, collected her cleaning things, and walked back toward the servants' stairs with the composed, unremarkable gait of a woman who had spent an unremarkable morning in an unremarkable room. Inside, she was performing a rapid and ruthless reassessment of every assumption she had made about her situation. She had believed she was hidden. She had believed Ashford Manor was a temporary inconvenience, a cage built from condescension rather than intent, one she could eventually maneuver her way out of with patience and information. She had believed that the danger she faced was diffuse and manageable, The ambient hostility of a world that did not know what to do with women who knew too much. She had been wrong. The cage was specific and intentional, and its lock had been paid for by a man who was currently managing legal proceedings in London that could, apparently, be derailed by her testimony. Which meant there were people in London who did not know where she was. Which meant there were proceedings happening right now in which her absence was a crucial piece of Harwick's strategy. Which meant that the 12-month clock Harwick had written into his arrangement was not arbitrary. It was precisely calibrated to the timeline of those proceedings. Which meant she had considerably less time than she had thought. And then, beneath all of it, pressing up through the layers of calculation and strategy with the particular insistence of a truth that refuses to be filed away. The Duke had known. He had known why she was here. He had accepted money to keep her here. He had spoken about her in her presence, dismissed her, reduced her to furniture, and done all of it with the full knowledge that she was not a charitable obligation, but a woman someone powerful wanted silenced. The coldness she had attributed to grief and architecture had another layer entirely beneath it, and that layer was complicity. She climbed the servants' stairs and went to her room and stood at the narrow window above the kitchen garden for a long time. She did not cry. She had learned not to waste water on things that could not be changed, only navigated. But she allowed herself, in the privacy of that small room, to feel the full weight of it, the precise, specific heaviness of being betrayed by someone you had, despite every reasonable argument against it, begun to trust. She stood with it. She breathed through it. And then she opened her notebook and began to write. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening with the particular violence of weather that has been building quietly for days, the kind that fools you with its patience, and then reminds you, all at once, that patience was never restraint, but simply accumulation. Ilara had watched it coming since morning. She had stood at the kitchen garden window before dawn and seen the sky in the east carrying that specific bruised yellow that meant the air was full of water waiting for permission to fall, and she had noted it with the same practical attention she brought to everything. The storm would arrive by evening. It would be severe enough to make the roads impassable by nightfall. And anyone currently at Ashford Manor would remain at Ashford Manor until morning at the earliest. Lord Harwick was currently at Ashford Manor. He had arrived the previous afternoon on the pretext of business with the Duke. Estate matters, he had told Mrs. Hartwell at the door, with the smooth confidence of a man who was accustomed to his pretexts being accepted without examination. He had been given the second guest room in the West Wing, the good one with the view of the park, and he had dined with the Duke and Vivian the previous evening in a dinner that Ilara had served with composed efficiency, while reading every exchange across the table with the focused attention of someone who understood that what was said and what was meant were two entirely different conversations. What was said, the cordial, carefully managed discourse of two men discussing the management of shared financial interests with the polished vagueness that money requires in polite company. What was meant, Harwick was checking. He wanted to see her, assess the situation, confirm that the arrangement was holding. She had watched him watch her across the table with a particular quality of attention that was simultaneously proprietary and dismissive. The gaze of a man inspecting something he owned rather than someone he perceived. She had returned his gaze once, briefly, with the blank and cooperative expression she had perfected over years, and she had seen him relax fractionally, satisfied. Good. Let him be satisfied. She had spent the 24 hours since finding the letter making decisions. She had turned the problem over from every angle with the systematic thoroughness she brought to all problems that carried genuine stakes. And she had arrived at a set of conclusions that she was not entirely comfortable with, but that she recognized, with a clear-eyed honesty she demanded of herself, as correct. She could not leave. Not yet. She had no money, no London connections she could reach in time, and no proof in a form that a court would accept from a woman who could not speak testimony aloud. Running would signal alarm, which would give Harwick cause to move more aggressively, and she did not yet know how far his reach extended beyond Ashford Manor's borders. What she had was here. What she needed was here. The letter in the ledger was here, and while she could not take it without alerting Harwick, she had reproduced it in her notebook word for word, and her notebook never left her person. She needed two additional things: corroborating evidence that connected Harwick to the Aldbourne matter directly, and a means of getting that evidence to someone in London who could use it. She had identified, through careful research in the Duke's library over 3 separate midnight visits, the name of the barrister currently managing the Aldbourne proceedings, and she had written a letter she intended to post from the village, not through the household post, which she did not trust, at the earliest opportunity. What she had not accounted for in the architecture of her planning was the storm. And what she had not accounted for in any architecture whatsoever was being cornered. It happened at 8:30 in the evening, when the storm had been fully committed to its violence for an hour, and the house had been sealed against it, shutters latched, fires built up, the guests and family settled in the main rooms, while the wind pressed itself against the window panes with a low, constant insistence. Alara had been moving between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying the supper things back in the company of the kitchen maid, when the kitchen maid remembered something she had forgotten in the pantry, and turned back, and Alara continued alone into the east corridor. She had taken perhaps 12 steps when the door of the corridor's side room opened, and Lord Harwick stepped out. She stopped. He stopped. And then he smiled, the particular smile of a man who has just been handed something he had been waiting for. And he stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. "Miss Voss," he said. He said it with the comfortable ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was satisfied with how it was beginning. What a fortunate accident. She watched his lips and kept her face composed. He moved toward her at a measured pace, not rushing, not threatening in the theatrical way that announces itself, but advancing with the calm, proprietary confidence of a man who had calculated that there was nothing she could do about it. The corridor was long and the storm was loud, and the nearest occupied room was the drawing room at the far end of the west wing, and she was, as he understood it, a woman who could neither call for help nor articulate a coherent account of any encounter afterward. He had built his confidence on the same foundation as everyone else. She was mute. She was therefore powerless. The equation was, to him, that simple. "I want to discuss your situation," he said, stopping at a distance that was precisely calibrated to be close enough to intimidate without providing, to any hypothetical observer, the unambiguous evidence of threat. He had done this before. She could tell by the calibration. "You have been very comfortable here, I understand. Very well looked after. That comfort is something I have taken considerable trouble to arrange, and I think it would be in your interest to reflect on that." She stood straight. She did not step back. She had learned at considerable cost that stepping back invited advance, and she was done providing invitations to men who had not been welcomed. "The arrangement," he continued, his voice dropping to the conversational register he used for things that were not, in fact, conversational, "has a duration. 12 months. After that, you are free to go wherever you choose and do whatever you like, and I will never trouble myself with you again. But the 12 months must be completed. Do you understand me?" He paused, studying her face with the assessing look of a man who was accustomed to reading submission in other people's expressions, and was waiting for it to appear. "The difficulty," he said, when she offered him nothing, "is that you have been making yourself somewhat conspicuous. Moving about the house at unusual hours, showing rather more initiative than your position would suggest." He tilted his head. "I find myself wondering whether Lord Ashford is aware of the full extent of his ward's capabilities, and whether, if he were made more fully aware, he might find the arrangement less convenient." This was the threat beneath the threat, not the overt one he had started with, but the more sophisticated one underneath it. He was telling her that he could go to the Duke and complicate her position here, could frame her exploration of the house as something suspicious, something that warranted closer management. He was telling her that the cage could become smaller. She held his gaze and said nothing, because she had nothing to say to him, nothing that would reach him, nothing that would serve any purpose other than his satisfaction. She was thinking with the rapid and controlled clarity that danger had always produced in her about what she needed and what she had and how much time she had to work with. She had turned in her mind to the third option she had identified and set aside, the one that required another person, and therefore required trust, which was the currency she was least able to afford and most in need of, when the movement registered at the far end of the corridor. She felt it before she saw it. The shift in the quality of the shadows at the corridor's western end, the slight change in the light. She did not allow her gaze to move from Harwick's face. To do so would tell him to look, but in her peripheral vision, she tracked it with the full attention she kept there. A figure, standing very still, in shirt sleeves, without a coat, with a particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has been there long enough to understand what they are witnessing. The Duke. She did not know how long he had been there. She did not know what he had heard, though the storm's noise against the shutters had rendered most of the conversation inaudible at any distance. But she knew, from the quality of his stillness, from the particular set of his shoulders in the low light, that he had heard enough. And she knew, from the fact that he had not yet moved, that he was still processing what enough meant. Harwick, who was positioned with his back to the corridor's far end, noticed nothing. "I trust," Harwick said, finishing the thought he had apparently been building toward, "that we understand each other." Alara looked at him. She let the silence run for 3 full seconds, long enough to be deliberate, long enough to communicate that she was not, under any circumstances, agreeing to be managed. Then she stepped sideways, one measured step out of the geometry of the conversation, and turned to walk back the way she had come. Harwick's hand came out. Not striking, not quite, but closing around her arm, above the elbow with the grip of a man making a point about who was in possession of the situation. In the corridor's far end, the stillness broke. The Duke moved. She felt the vibration of his steps through the floorboards before Harwick registered anything, and by the time Harwick turned, his expression shifting from controlled menace to rapid recalibration. Callum Wren was already there, and the expression on his face was something Alara had never seen on it before. Not the cold, architectural displeasure of a man whose household had been inconvenienced. Not the guarded, armored composure of a man managing his grief through the medium of distance. Something underneath all of that, something that the architecture had been built to contain, and that had apparently, in this corridor, in this storm, with Harwick's hand on Alara's arm, stopped being containable. "Take your hand off her," he said. 3 words. Quiet as everything he said was quiet, but carrying, in that quietness, something that made the hairs on Alara's arms rise through the fabric of her sleeve. Harwick released her arm. His expression had found a new configuration, one she recognized as a man reordering his options with rapid, practiced intelligence, already 3 moves ahead of this moment and calculating how to use it. "Ashford," he said, with the measured ease of someone redirecting a current rather than opposing it. "I was simply—" "I know what you were doing," the Duke said. The storm pressed against the shutters. The candle in the wall sconce between them threw their shadows long and uneven against the corridor walls. And in the space between those 3 people, something that had been suspended for weeks, something held in careful, watchful, dangerous tension, came finally and completely to the ground. Alara looked at the Duke. He was looking at Harwick, but in the way that she had come to recognize, the way that meant some portion of his attention was directed elsewhere. She knew that he was aware of her with a completeness that had nothing to do with looking. She walked, steadily and without hurry, toward the servants' corridor. She did not run. She had never been a person who ran. But behind her, as she turned the corner, she heard the Duke say, in that same quiet, total voice, "We will speak in my study." Now, she did not need to see his face to know what it looked like. She had read him for weeks, after all. She knew every word before it left his lips. She did not sleep. This was not unusual. She had never been a reliable sleeper, had always spent the hours between midnight and dawn in the particular wakefulness of a mind that did not know how to stop processing the world, simply because the world had gone dark. But this night had a different quality to its sleeplessness. It was not the restless, circular kind that feeds on itself without producing anything. It was the focused, productive sleeplessness of a person who has arrived, finally, at a decision they have been building toward for a long time, and who needs the quiet hours to execute it properly. She sat at the small desk in her room, with 2 candles burning and her notebook open, and she wrote. She had written thousands of letters in her life, letters she had never sent, letters she had sent and regretted, letters she had composed in her head while standing in rooms where she was not permitted to speak and delivered later, in ink, to people who had not known they were receiving the conversation she had been having with them for hours. She had written to doctors who dismissed her, to administrators who filed her, to solicitors who managed the small estate her parents had left, and whom she had never been permitted to meet in person because someone had always, at every stage of her life, decided that her silence made her presence in formal proceedings impractical. She was good at letters. She had made herself good at them the way you make yourself good at the only instrument available. But she had never written a letter like this one. She began it 3 times and discarded the first 2 beginnings. One too formal, one too careful. Both of them written in the register of a woman managing a man rather than speaking to one, which was not, she decided, what this letter needed to be. What it needed to be was true. Completely, specifically, uncomfortably true, in a way that she had almost never allowed herself to be in writing, because truth of that order required a level of exposure she had spent her entire life protecting herself against. She sat back from the desk and looked at the candle flame for a long moment, and she thought about the corridor, about the quality of the Duke's stillness in the shadows before he moved, about the 3 words he had delivered with a quietness that was more absolute than shouting, about the expression on his face, that unprecedented, unguarded, unarchitectured expression, and what it had told her in the language she was most fluent in. She thought about the portrait in the gallery, the letters sorted into 2 piles, the 11 paces in the east corridor before dinner, the study, the brandy, the cold ash in the grate, the library and the Rousseau, and the way he had sat down in the chair opposite her not to reprimand but to reconsider. She thought about the letter she had found in the ledger and what it meant about him, all of it, the complicity and the money and the calculation. And she thought about what she had decided in the course of a sleepless night and a storm and a corridor confrontation to do with that knowledge. She had decided to give him the chance to be better than the worst thing he had done. This was not sentimentality. It was, she thought, the most honest assessment she could make of the person she had been observing for 8 weeks. She had read him with more attention and more accuracy than anyone in his life had read him in years, possibly ever. And what she had read was not simply the architecture of a cold man. It was the architecture of a man who had built coldness over something that was not cold at all, and who had made choices from inside that structure that the something underneath would not, she believed, have made. She could be wrong. She had been wrong before about people she had trusted, and the cost had been significant. But she had also learned, in the long and careful school of her particular life, to distinguish between the wishful reading of a lonely person and the accurate reading of a trained one, and this, she was almost certain, was the latter. She picked up her pen, and she wrote the 3rd beginning, and this time she did not stop. She wrote him everything. She began with who she was, not the version that had been handed to him, the mute ward, the charity case, the convenient solution to his mother's matchmaking, but the actual version. Ilara Voss, daughter of a Viennese musicologist and an English naturalist, who had both died of fever when she was 6, raised in a series of institutions and private households that had found her variously remarkable and inconvenient in roughly equal measure, educated by a succession of tutors, some of whom had been genuinely gifted and generous, and several of whom had attempted to limit her precisely because of what her mind was capable of producing. Placed with Lady Pemworth at 19, not as a ward in any meaningful sense, but as a companion, and Ilara had come to understand, a repository. Lady Pemworth had been a woman who possessed a great deal of dangerous knowledge about a great many powerful people, and she had been, in her final years, in the process of organizing that knowledge into a form that could survive her. She had not survived long enough. Ilara wrote about the Aldbourne matter, what she knew, what she had witnessed, what she had been present for in Lady Pemworth's sitting room on an October evening 16 months ago, when 2 men had come to call, and had spoken with complete freedom in front of the silent companion, because the silent companion could not, they were certain, hear a word. She wrote about what those men had said in the precise, detailed, word-for-word account that her memory was capable of producing, a memory trained by necessity to be a recording instrument of complete reliability, because she had never had any other way of keeping what she heard. She wrote about finding the letter in the ledger. She wrote it without accusation and without performance, simply as fact, the way she wrote everything in her notebook, because the facts were damning enough on their own and required no decoration. She told him what she knew about his arrangement with Harwick, the 400 pounds, the 12-month timeline, the word testimony, and what it implied about what she carried. She told him about the barrister in London and the letter she had prepared to post from the village, and what she intended it to accomplish. And then she stopped and she looked at what she had written, and she wrote the part that cost her the most. She told him what she had observed of him. Not the case she was making, not the evidence she had assembled, but the other thing. The private catalogue of a woman who had spent 8 weeks reading a man with the full force of the only instrument she had ever been able to rely on entirely. The portrait in the gallery and what it told her about his grief. The letter in his coat pocket and what it told her about his fear. The library and what it had told her about the person who existed beneath the person he had built. The corridor and what his 3 words had told her about something she had no tidy category for, but that she was no longer willing to pretend she had not noticed. She told him that she understood why he had made the arrangement with Harwick. She did not excuse it. She told him that with the same directness she had brought to everything else, that she understood the financial pressure of the estate, the vulnerability of a man who had inherited grief and debt in equal measure, the particular susceptibility of a proud person to an offer that allowed them to be complicit in something wrong while describing it to themselves as practical. She understood it. She did not forgive it yet. She thought, if he chose to earn it, that forgiveness was available. But she would not offer it as a gift before it had been earned, because she was not a person who could afford to give things away before they had been paid for. She ended the letter with the most difficult sentence she had ever composed, which was also the simplest. I have read 1,000 lies in my life on 1,000 sets of lips, and I have learned to recognize the truth not because it looks different, but because it feels different, because there is a quality in a true thing, in the face of a person telling it, that no performance can entirely replicate. In the corridor last night, you told 3 words of truth, and I heard all of them. I am asking you now to tell me more. She folded the letter. She sealed it with a small amount of candle wax, pressing the bowl of her pen into it, because she had no seal. She wrote his name on the front, Lord Callum Wren, in her cleanest hand, and she sat with it in her palms for a moment, feeling the warm solidity of it, the specific gravity of a thing you have made and cannot unmake. Then she rose, dressed quietly in the pre-dawn dark, and moved through the sleeping house. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the kind of quiet that only exists after violence, a washed, transparent silence, the world rinsed and raw and very still. The corridors were cold and the house smelled of extinguished candles and rain-soaked stone, and Alara moved through it with her accustomed soundlessness, down the main stairs and along the ground floor corridor to the study. She slid the letter under the door. She stood at the door for a moment, her fingertips still resting lightly against the wood, the door she could not hear behind, the room she could not see into, and she allowed herself to feel the full exposure of what she had just done. She had handed a man she had every reason to distrust the complete contents of her mind and the precise location of her vulnerability. And she had done it not because she was certain he would handle it well, but because she had read him closely enough to believe he might. The distance between might and certain was the distance she lived in. She had always lived there. It was, in its way, the only honest place available. She lifted her fingers from the door. She walked back through the washed morning silence of the house, up the stairs, and into her room, where the 2 candles had burned low and the notebook lay open on the desk. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the gray light beginning at the window above the kitchen garden, and she waited with the patient, particular stillness of a woman who has said everything she had to say and now had nothing to do but discover what the world intended to say back. She did not wait as long as she expected to. It was perhaps an hour later, the house just beginning its morning sounds, the kitchen stirring, the first movement of servants in the lower corridors, when she felt it. The vibration of a footstep on the staircase. Not the light, quick footstep of a housemaid. A heavier, longer stride. ascending with a purpose that was different in quality from the ordinary purposeful movement of a house beginning its day. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A pause, long enough to be a decision being made rather than a hesitation. And then a knock, not the formal deferential knock of a servant delivering a message, but the direct, human knock of a person who needs to be let in and has come to ask. She crossed the room. She put her hand on the door. She opened it. He was standing in the corridor in the clothes he had worn the previous evening, which meant he had not slept either, and he was holding her letter in one hand with the particular grip of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has no intention of putting it down. His face was undone. That was the only word that fit it with any accuracy. Not broken, not devastated, but undone in the specific sense of something that has been carefully and deliberately constructed over a long period of time, being taken carefully and deliberately apart. He had read the letter. That much was evident in every line of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light was coming gray and clean through the corridor window behind him, and the house was just beginning to be loud around them, and neither of them moved for a long, full moment that contained, in its stillness, everything they had not yet said. Then he held up the letter, and he said, with the directness of a man who has decided that the structures he built for self-protection have cost more than they were worth. Tell me what you need me to do. She had read 1,000 lies. She had read them in drawing rooms and dining rooms and corridors and carriages, on the faces of people who had made an entire career of their own performances. This was not a lie. She stepped back from the door and let him in. There is a specific kind of courage that is not dramatic, that does not announce itself with raised voices or grand gestures or the satisfying clarity of a confrontation that resolves itself neatly in a single scene. It is the quieter, harder kind. The courage of a person who has looked at the worst thing they have done and chosen to stand in front of it without the protection of justification, and to let it be exactly as bad as it is. Callum Wren had been practicing justification for 3 years. He was, by the time Alara opened her door to him on that washed gray morning, extraordinarily good at it. He had justified the distance he had placed between himself and his grief by calling it composure. He had justified the coldness he had built into his manner by calling it efficiency. He had justified the arrangement with Harwick. And here the architecture of his self-deception was most elaborate, most carefully constructed, most deeply load-bearing, by telling himself that the girl was comfortable, that she was housed and fed and treated no worse than any other member of his household staff, that £400 was a sum his estate genuinely needed, and that a woman who could neither speak nor hear could not, in any meaningful sense, be harmed by being kept in a comfortable house in the English countryside for 12 months. He had believed all of it. That was the most important thing to understand about him in this moment. He had believed it completely, with the sincere and total conviction of a man who needed it to be true. He had not made the arrangement with the consciousness of a villain. He had made it with the consciousness of a practical man managing competing pressures, and he had filed the discomfort it generated under the same category where he filed all discomfort, things to be managed rather than felt. Alara's letter had taken that filing system apart page by page. He had found it when he came to his study at 5:30 in the morning. He had not slept, had spent the hours after his confrontation with Harwick sitting in the leather chair by the cold study fireplace in the particular suspended state of a man whose understanding of his own situation has been violently revised and who is waiting for the new version to become solid enough to stand on. He had not expected the letter. He had stepped over it without registering it. And then some peripheral awareness, some instinct that had been sharpening itself for weeks in the presence of this particular woman, had stopped him and turned him back. He had read it standing up, as he had always read the things he was afraid of. He had read it 3 times. Not because he needed to, his comprehension was immediate and complete, and that was precisely the problem, but because the 3 readings were, each of them, a different kind of reckoning. The first was for information. The second was for feeling. The third was for decision. By the time he climbed the stairs to the East Wing corridor, he had completed all 3. He sat now in the single chair in her small room. She had gestured him to it with the natural economy of a person organizing a space for a conversation, and had herself taken a position on the edge of the desk, facing him, with the notebook open on her knee, and the pen in her hand. And he was aware, with a clarity he found both uncomfortable and necessary, that the balance of knowledge between them was entirely reversed from what it had been on the day she arrived. She knew him. She had read him with a thoroughness and accuracy that no one in his life had managed since his father, and possibly not even then. He had not known her at all. He had not tried to. He had categorized her as furniture and left her in the corner of his household and his conscience, and she had spent 8 weeks building a complete and detailed portrait of him from the corner he had assigned her. And the portrait was, he had to admit this, he was in the process of admitting it now, far more honest than any he would have drawn of himself. "I need to tell you," he began, and then stopped, because the sentence he had constructed on the way up the stairs had already proved insufficient by the time he was sitting in front of her. He looked at her, at the level, patient, entirely unperforming expression she offered him, and he felt the inadequacy of every formal register he possessed. He had been trained from birth to speak in the language of propriety and position, and propriety and position were, he was realizing, precisely what this moment required him to set down. He started again. "The arrangement with Harwick," he said. "I told myself it was practical. I told myself you were comfortable, that no harm was done, that the money," he stopped. He looked at his hands. "The money was real. The debt is real. That is true. But I used it as a reason when it was, in fact, an excuse. And there is a difference, and I knew the difference, and I chose the excuse." He looked up at her. She was writing. Her pen moved steadily across the notebook page, and she turned it to face him when she had finished. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked me to tell you the truth," he said. "And because," he paused again, and this pause was different from the others, not a search for words but a decision about how far to go, how much of the interior to expose, how much of the architecture to dismantle in a single morning. "Because I have been speaking about you in your presence since the day you arrived, and I believed you could not understand me, and you understood every word, and I need to account for that." Her pen moved. "You are accounting to yourself, not to me." He sat with that for a moment. "Perhaps," he said. "Is that wrong?" "No. But be honest about which one you are doing." He looked at her, this woman who had been in his house for 8 weeks, in the corner of his vision for 8 weeks, whom he had placed there with a deliberate and comfortable carelessness, and who had spent those 8 weeks becoming, with complete thoroughness, and without his participation, the most honest presence in his life. He thought about what that meant. He let himself think about it directly, without the filing system, without the architecture. "Both," he said. "I am doing both." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something and held it up. "That is the most truthful thing you have said to me." The morning was fully arrived now. The gray light had warmed fractionally, and the sounds of the household were building around them. The kitchen and the corridors, and the ordinary machinery of a house beginning its day with complete indifference to the extraordinary conversation happening 3 floors above it. Callum was aware that he should be concerned about propriety. A duke in a female servant's room at 6 in the morning was the kind of thing that houses noticed and remembered, and he found that he was not concerned, which was itself a kind of information. "Harwick," he said, shifting, because the personal accounting was necessary, but it was not all that was necessary. And she had written him a letter that contained, in addition to the thing that had undone him, a set of practical facts that required practical action. The Aldbourne matter. What you witnessed at Lady Pemworth's. She was already writing. She handed him the notebook and he read for several minutes, a detailed, organized account of the meeting she had witnessed, the names, the figures discussed, the precise nature of what Harwick and his associate had arranged regarding the Aldbourne estate and its creditors, the specific fraudulent misdirection of funds that had left 3 families without their inheritances and 1 man, the estate's former steward, currently imprisoned for debts that were not his. She had organized it with the clarity of a legal mind, dates, figures, names, the sequence of events she had observed, and the logical connections she had been able to draw between them using documents she had subsequently accessed. He read it twice. When he looked up, her expression was composed and direct and waiting. "This is enough," he said. "If it can be attested in the right form before the right authority, this is more than enough to overturn the proceedings and implicate Harwick directly." She nodded. "You cannot give spoken testimony." He said it not as a limitation, but as a fact to be worked around, which was, she thought, the first time anyone had framed it that way in her presence. But written testimony, properly witnessed and sworn before a magistrate, there is precedent. I have a solicitor in London who is not connected to Harwick, a man I have trusted for 6 years. He can advise us on the correct form. Us. She caught the word and held it. She wrote, "You would do this." "I would do this," he said. It was not a question, not a performance of nobility or a renegotiation of his self-image. It was a simple declarative statement, delivered with the same quiet certainty with which he delivered everything, except that the thing beneath this certainty was entirely different from what had powered his certainties before. She wrote for a moment. Then, "Harwick will not accept it quietly. He has reach in London. And he knows now that he saw your face last night. I know. He will move against you. He will try." She looked at him steadily, with the expression he had come to think of as her reading expression, that focused, precise assessment that was not coldness but concentration. He had learned, over 8 weeks of being its occasional subject, that it was the highest form of attention she offered, and that being on the receiving end of it was uncomfortable and illuminating, and something he had come to want more of in the way you want more of something that is genuinely good for you, even when it is difficult. "Why," she wrote, "did you come up here yourself? You could have sent a message through Mrs. Hartwell." He looked at the question for a long moment. "Because you wrote to me as a person," he said. "And I wanted to answer you as one." The pen was still in her hand, but she was not writing. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, not the reading expression, not the composed exterior, but something quieter and more interior, something she had not, he thought, intended to let him see. He recognized it because it was the same expression he had been trying to conceal from her for weeks, the expression of a person who has been managing alone for a very long time and has just been offered, unexpectedly, the possibility of not having to. He rose from the chair. Not to leave, to move, because sitting still in the face of what he was feeling was requiring more architecture than he currently had available. And he had decided this morning to stop building architecture and start feeling the things beneath it. He stood at the window above the kitchen garden and looked out at the washed, clear world the storm had left behind. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited in the way she waited for everything, with patience that was not passivity, but a kind of active, generous stillness. "I am going to speak to Harwick this morning," he said, "before he has the opportunity to leave. I will tell him that the arrangement is at an end, that his presence on my estate is no longer welcome, and that any attempt to interfere with the legal proceedings I intend to initiate will be met with a full presentation of the evidence you have compiled." He paused. "I want you to know that before it happens, I want you to know that it is not a negotiation." She wrote. He turned from the window and came back to read it. "He will tell you that I am worthless as a witness, that a mute woman's written account is inadmissible. He will try to reduce me again. He can try," Callum said. And then, because this was a morning for true things, and this was true, "I have been guilty of the same reduction. I know what it looks like. I know what it sounds like. And I intend to make it very clear to Geoffrey Harwick, and to anyone else who requires the clarification, that the value of what you have to say has nothing to do with the mechanism by which you say it." She was very still. "He did not think that when I arrived," she wrote. "No," he said. "I did not." He held her gaze. "I am thinking it now. I intend to go on thinking it. And I understand completely that the distance between then and now is something you have every right to hold me to." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the full weight of it, her assessment, her precision, her absolute refusal to offer comfort where comfort had not been earned. He stood in it, and he did not retreat from it, because retreating was what the old architecture had been for, and he was done with the architecture. She wrote the last thing she wrote to him that morning. She wrote it slowly, which was not her habit, She wrote with the deliberateness of someone choosing each word with specific care. Then go and do it. And when you have, come and find me in the garden. I will be there. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked up the letter she had written him, still in his hand, had not left his hand since he had read it at 5 a.m, and he put it in his coat pocket, against his chest. She watched him do it. She watched the specific, deliberate placement of it. And she looked back at his face, and she saw, in the language she was most fluent in, exactly what it meant. He left her room. She heard his footsteps. She never heard footsteps, but she felt them, as she always felt his, through the floorboards and the bones of the old house, descending the stairs with purpose, heading toward whatever confrontation awaited him at the other end of the corridor. She sat for a long moment at the desk, with the empty morning and the burnt-low candles and her notebook still open before her. Then she smiled, small, private, entirely her own, and she went to find her coat. The garden in the aftermath of a storm is a particular kind of beautiful. Not the composed, deliberate beauty of a garden on a fine day, when everything is arranged in its best light and performing its purpose with confidence, but a raw beauty, stripped and rinsed and honest. The kind that exists not because it has been cultivated, but because it has survived. Elara had always preferred it this way. She stood at the far end of the kitchen garden, where the low stone wall met the corner of the old orchard, with her coat pulled close against the morning cold and her face turned toward the east, where the light was coming in low and clear over the fields. The ground was wet beneath her boots, and the air smelled of rain-soaked earth and something green and beginning, that particular scent of early May after water, when the season is committing itself irrevocably to warmth and everything buried is pushing upward with a cheerful insistence of things that have been waiting a long time. She had been in the garden for perhaps an hour. She had come here directly after he left, had taken her coat from its hook and gone down the back stairs and out through the kitchen door into the washed, quiet morning, because she had needed, after the density of that conversation and the exposure of that letter and the specific, significant weight of watching a man choose to be better than his worst decision, to be somewhere open, somewhere with a horizon. The manor behind her and the fields before her and the sky above her enormous and clear, and nothing between her and all of it but the ordinary honest air. She did not know how long it would take. She did not know what Harwick would do when confronted, whether he would fold quietly with the careful dignity of a man managing his exposure, or whether he would push back, threaten, attempt to reframe the situation with the practiced agility of someone who had been navigating the gap between what he did and what he could be held accountable for his entire adult life. She thought, on balance, that he would fold. She had read him across that dinner table and in that corridor, and beneath the confidence and the calibration, she had seen the thing that was always beneath the confidence of men who operated as he did, the fundamental, structural dependence on other people's silence. Remove the silence, and the confidence had nothing to stand on. He would know that. He was not a stupid man. She had given Callum everything he needed. Whether he had the capacity to use it was no longer in her hands, and she had made her peace with that in the long quiet before the dawn. She had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, the precise and difficult art of doing everything within her power and then releasing the outcome, not with the defeated surrender of a person who has stopped caring, but with the active, intentional release of someone who understands that the part of the situation that belongs to another person is, genuinely and completely, that person's responsibility. She had written the letter. She had handed him the evidence. She had opened the door. What he did with all of it was his. She was thinking about this, about the architecture of trust, about the specific courage required to build something on a foundation that another person controls, when she felt it. The change in the quality of the morning, the particular vibration through the old stone wall beside her, the sequence of footsteps she had learned to distinguish from every other footstep in the house because her body had, without consulting her, taken to tracking them the way a compass takes to north. She did not turn immediately. She gave herself the 3 seconds she always gave herself, the pause that was not hesitation but preparation, the gathering of herself before the thing that required all of her. Then she turned. He was coming across the kitchen garden with the long, certain stride she knew, and his coat was on now, and his cravat was in place, and he looked composed. not the cold, architectural composure of the man she had first watched across a crowded salon. Something different. Something that carried composure not as a defense, but as a quality of having passed through something difficult and arrived, intact, on the other side. He stopped when he reached her. There were perhaps 3 feet between them, and the morning was around them both, the wet garden, the clear sky, the far fields still shining with last night's rain. She looked at him with a question that was simply her face, open and waiting and entirely itself. "He is gone," Callum said. She held his gaze. It was not a comfortable conversation. The corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when he was being precise about something he also found darkly amusing. He attempted several reframings. "I did not accept them. I presented him with what you had compiled, in sufficient detail to establish that I was not speculating. And I told him that my solicitor in London would be receiving a full written account by messenger this afternoon, and that the account would be accompanied by my personal attestation and my willingness to appear before whatever authority required it." He paused. He left within the hour. She breathed. Just one breath, slow and deliberate, releasing something she had been holding for weeks. She reached for her notebook, always in her pocket, always there, and wrote, "Your mother. Does she know? I told her this morning, before I spoke to Harwick." His expression shifted to something warmer, more unguarded. She was not surprised. About Harwick. She had her own suspicions about him that she had not been able to substantiate. A pause. She was considerably more surprised about the rest. Ilara wrote, "What is the rest?" He looked at her steadily. "That you speak French, Latin, and Greek. That you have been reading the library at midnight. That you have been observing this household with a precision and intelligence that I utterly fail to account for, and that I have been conducting myself accordingly, like an absolute fool." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote, "Your mother's response?" He said, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something light, something that was in the neighborhood of sheepishness, something that sat remarkably well on him, that she had thought from the beginning that you were remarkable, and that I was the last person in the house to notice. Ilara looked down at the notebook. She wrote one word and held it up. "Correct." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, had not, in 8 weeks of meticulous observation, managed to witness it. It was not the polished social laugh of a man performing amusement for company. It was the real thing, sudden and unguarded, low and genuine, the laugh of a person who has been laughed out of their own defenses and finds the experience, to their surprise, a relief rather than a threat. She watched it happen and felt something shift in the architecture of the morning, something open itself that had been closed. He looked at her when it had passed, and he looked at her with the full, uncalculated attention of a man who has stopped managing what he sees, and is simply, honestly seeing. "I want to talk to you," he said, "properly. About everything. About what you need, and the London proceedings, and my solicitor, and what form your testimony should take to be most effective, and what protections we need to put in place for you while the proceedings are ongoing." He paused. And this pause had a different quality from his usual pauses, less controlled, more human. "And about other things that are not the proceedings. If you are willing." She looked at him. She took her time with it, which was her prerogative and always had been. She looked at him with the reading expression, the full, focused, precise attention that she knew. Now that he knew what it was, he understood was the highest form of regard she possessed. She read the truth of him. There was the grief. It was still there, would always be there in some form, but it was different now, sitting differently in him, as though it had been moved from a load-bearing position to one where it could simply be what it was, without the whole structure depending on its concealment. There was the intelligence and the stubbornness and the particular quality of pride that could, she now believed, be redirected from a defensive into a generous instrument. There was the crack she had first found at the portrait in the gallery, wider now, admitting considerably more light. There was the man who had sorted his letters into 2 piles every morning because one of them frightened him, and who had paced 11 steps before dinner because the feeling needed somewhere to go, and who had sat in the chair across from her in the library not to reprimand but to reconsider, and who had climbed the stairs to a servant's room at 6 in the morning, because she had written to him as a person, and he had wanted to answer her as one. She looked at all of it. She wrote in the notebook and handed it to him. He read it and looked up at her with an expression that was not polished or managed or composed in the architectural sense, but simply open. The expression of a man who has decided that being seen is worth the cost of being visible. She had written, "I have been watching you for 8 weeks. I know what I am looking at. Ask me your other things." He reached out then, slowly, with the considered deliberateness of a person who has thought about this and decided to mean it, and took the notebook gently from her hands. Not to keep it. To hold it, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else, carefully, with the full awareness of the trust the holding represents. He set it on the stone wall beside them, and then he offered her his hand. Not the formal glove gesture of social convention. His gloves were in his coat pocket, and his hand was bare and real and steady in the cold May morning, offered with the simple directness of a person asking for something they are not certain they deserve and asking anyway. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She had read 1,000 faces. She had built her life in the silence between words, in the space where the truth lived that speech was too imprecise to carry. She had survived by watching, by listening in the only language available to her, by knowing things that the world had no idea she knew. She had been reduced and dismissed and bought and sold and filed away, and she had read every word of every dismissal and every transaction from the lips of people who believed the air around her was entirely safe. She had survived all of it. She had survived into this garden on this morning, with a storm-washed sky above her and the smell of May in the air, and this man's hand held out in the clear, cold light with nothing performed about it. Just the bare, honest, unarchitectured gesture of someone asking to begin. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a warmth that was steady and undemonstrative, the warmth of something that intended to last rather than to impress. And they stood together at the end of the kitchen garden with the old orchard behind them and the wide fields before them, and the whole morning open and possible in every direction. She did not need words for this. She had never needed words for the truest things. She had always had a better language. There is a story the world tells about silence, that it is absence, that it is lack, that it is the space where meaning has failed to arrive, that a person who cannot speak is a person who cannot be heard, and a person who cannot be heard is a person who does not fully exist. Alara Voss had been living inside that story her entire life. She had been handed it in schoolrooms and sitting rooms and institutions and grand houses, by doctors and administrators and solicitors and dukes, by well-meaning people and careless ones and genuinely cruel ones, by everyone who had ever looked at the stillness she carried and mistaken it for emptiness. They were all wrong. She had known they were wrong. She had spent her life knowing it with the quiet, persistent certainty of someone carrying a truth that the world was not yet ready to receive. But here is what she also knew, and what this story has always truly been about. It is not enough to know your own truth. It must be seen. Not performed, not argued, not forced into the world's acceptance through sheer persistence, but genuinely, honestly seen by someone who has done the work of looking, who has set down their assumptions and their convenience and their comfortable architecture and simply, at last, looked. Callum Wren had looked. He had looked late, and he had looked imperfectly, and the road between his first glance across a crowded salon and the morning he stood in a washed garden with his hand in hers was paved with choices he could not be proud of. But he had arrived. And arrival, when it is honest, counts for something. The London proceedings resolved themselves in the autumn of that year. The barrister received Alara's account, properly attested and witnessed, and the written testimony of a woman who had been present and paying attention proved, in the precise and irrefutable language of documented fact, to be exactly as powerful as any spoken word. Lord Harwick's careful architecture came apart the way all architecture built on other people's silence eventually comes apart, thoroughly and without dignity. The steward imprisoned for debts that were not his was released. 3 families received the restitution they were owed. Alara received something she had never had. The formal legal recognition that her word was as good as anyone's. Better, in fact, than most. Because she had been listening and remembering and writing it all down, while everyone else assumed the room was safe. As for the Duke, the cold, practical, magnificently wrong Duke of Ashford, who had once looked at a silent woman and seen only a convenient solution, he learned, slowly and willingly and with the particular thoroughness of an intelligent person genuinely trying, to read a different language. Not with her fluency. He would never have her fluency, but with enough skill in time to understand most of what she was saying, and the wisdom to ask her about the rest. She taught him, among other things, that silence is not absence. It is simply a different kind of listening. And some of the truest things in this world are spoken in exactly that register, if you are paying close enough attention to hear them. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you, if it reminded you of anyone you know or anything you have felt, leave a word in the comments. We read every one. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is a beautiful time to begin. There are more stories waiting. Stories of people overlooked and underestimated, of love built in unlikely places, of silence that turns out to have been speaking all along. We will see you in the next one.